Hi, my name is James, and I want to welcome you to our weekly Bible study. We are going through the life of Jesus Christ and trying to look at His teachings from a very practical, everyday, how can I live more like Jesus point of view. So if that's something that interests you, like and subscribe so that you can know when new Bible studies come out. I usually post these every Wednesday. This week we are in Mark chapter 12, and Jesus is at the temple, and He has a few people come up to Him with a question, and this question is meant to be a trap. And He knows that He's walking into a trap, and His reply is genius. But even more than that, His reply has ramifications and life lessons for every single one of us, whether we're trying to trap Jesus or whether we are actually trying to be more like Jesus. So grab your Bible, Mark chapter 12, and let's dive right in. Quick background before we read this little bit of text for today. So Jesus is at the temple. He's there with His disciples. This is in the last few days before His trial, crucifixion, and the resurrection. So a very, a very tense, high-strung week that we call Passion Week, where there is confrontation after confrontation between Him and Pharisees, Sadducees, chief priests, high priests. Everybody who had a high position basically was butting heads with Jesus. And so here we are. They had decided already that they wanted to trap Him. Some of them were looking for a reason to be able to prosecute and execute Him as a false teacher. So naturally then they need to find ways in which He's teaching false things. And so they keep throwing questions at Jesus, and every time they think, all right, this is it. This is our gotcha question where we're going to prove that He's not the Messiah, that He's not really going to be king, that He's not the Son of God, and that He's not even a faithful Jew. So that was the purpose behind all these little confrontations and skirmishes with Jesus. And every single time that they pitch one of these questions at Jesus, what they think is going to be a strikeout turns out to be a home run. Every single time, Jesus just knocks it out of the park. So let's read the question for today. Today they come to Him and they're pretty sure this is one of those gotcha questions. What is it that they asked Him? And they sent to Him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap Him in His talk. And they came to Him and said, Teacher, we know that you are true and do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not? But, knowing their hypocrisy, He said to them, Why put me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me look at it. And they brought one. And He said to them, Whose likeness and inscription is this? They said to Him, Caesar's. And Jesus said to them, Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they marveled at Him. All right, let's start with that last sentence. It says that they marveled at Him. What does it take for you to be wise enough in your answer that the person who's trying to trap you goes, wow, good answer? Well, let's look back and see. First, more background to this particular question. So they come and they ask Him about taxes. Why is this a big deal? A tax question seems an odd thing to ask a religious leader. Okay, so remember, we're talking about the Jews. We're talking about Israel. And they have been paying taxes to oppressive nations since the time of Babylon. So for hundreds of years, regime after regime has been keeping them under their thumb and making them pay taxes. It's built up centuries of resentment. It was just one more oppressive layer of taxes. They had regular taxes they had to pay. They had both civil taxes and religious taxes they had to pay, the temple tax and things like that. So they had, 4, 5, 6 layers of taxes easily that they had to deal with. It's kind of like living in, New York or California, or really Texas if you throw in the property taxes. They ain't great here, I'm telling you. So they were frustrated, right? And then there's more to it than that. They aren't just frustrated because they have a lot of taxes and there are all these layers. Again, this is tax by an occupational force. That's how they saw the Romans. And we might, from our vantage point, say, well, you were in Rome. That's not an occupation. That's your government. Yeah, this wasn't a democracy, folks, especially not for them. So this was an occupying force. Same way the Babylonians had been, same way to the northern tribes the Assyrians had been, and they were tired of it. Okay, they were sick and tired of it. As Americans and as Texans, I live in Texas, we can kind of relate. This isn't that much different in the way they felt than, say, the Alamo would have felt or the Boston Tea Party would have felt. This is something we can kind of relate to. So if you're trying to understand where they're coming from, just kind of, it's not an exact parallel, but just kind of put it in that part of your thinking, that this is a bit like that. So there is another layer to this. There's also the religious layer. If you were to pay the Roman tax, you paid this, of course, with Roman money, right? And that Roman money, the coins of the realm, had on it a picture of Caesar. And as they look at it, and this is why Jesus says, look at the coin, show me whose image is on it. They look at it, they see an image of Caesar. Well, that's actually two problems. One, constant reminder of who your oppressors are from their point of view. This is what they would have seen. And so there's just a constant resentment over his image being on their money. And they just hated that. Pulling out these coins and looking at that, it's just like, him again, right? So there's that, but there's something deeper. As you probably know, the Jews were not supposed to have, Ten Commandment level not supposed to have, graven images. And we most often think about this in terms of graven images that they were to worship. But the way that they took that, especially at this point in their history, was that you were not to have graven images, period. They didn't make statues to their heroes. There were no Moses statues, no Abraham statues, no Esther statues, nothing like that. And you didn't use them religiously. And for them to see this graven image, that's how they would have seen this. I don't look at a quarter and think, oh, it's a graven image of George Washington. But in its place and in its time, they would have seen that. And with good reason. Because my coin that has George Washington on it says, in God we trust, not in George we trust. But their coins said on one side, here is the Caesar, say Tiberius, here is the Caesar, and Tiberius is the Son of God. Now that's not God like Jehovah, Yahweh, that is the god of the Roman imperial cult, like Augustus. And so the coin was itself a form of idolatry with a graven image of the Caesar who wanted to be seen as God. It wasn't just taxes that were the problem. It was also an idolatry problem. And at this point in Israel's history, because you might be thinking, but didn't the Israelites really struggle with idolatry? I mean, golden calf, Baal worship, Molech, didn't they have a history? Yes, they did. But by the time Jesus is standing here in the temple, and especially among the people who are talking to him, they had learned the lessons of that more overt idolatry, and were in fact trying in their avoidance of even the image on the coin to really avoid these things. But were they successful? We'll get to that in Jesus' statement. Go back to the coin. So you look at the coin and it has a graven image of a man who is trying to make himself an idol god by calling himself the Son of the gods or the Son of God. And then you flip it over. And you know what's on the other side? You can Google this and look at the Roman coins. You know what's on the other side? High priest. So he calls himself the Son of God and the high priest. Now, that's kind of wild when we look at it from our perspective, because from our perspective, these Pharisees and Herodians are actually the ones who are in the presence of the Son of God and the true high priest. The book of Hebrews says Jesus is our forever high priest. But they don't even know it. They don't realize it. They don't recognize it. In fact, they are actively, purposefully rejecting the true Son of God and the true high priest while trying to entrap him over a coin that has a false Son of God and a false high priest. And their biggest problem with this coin is in this moment not actually the issue of the idolatry, but their biggest problem with this coin in this moment is that they would have to give it up and give it back to the Caesar who is idolatrous on it. That's kind of crazy when you think about it, isn't it? These men are arguing with Jesus and trying to get him to say that they can keep what they should not even really want to keep, according to their own objections to what's on the coin. And that's the genius behind Jesus looking at the coin and looking at them and saying, who's on that coin? Who's on that coin? Whose image is that? Whose likeness is that? Who's on that coin? Because they've asked the question, should we pay the taxes? Should we be having to do that? I shouldn't have to do that. I'm a child of God. I shouldn't have to give this money back to a Caesar who's idolatrous. But see, they don't see the inconsistency of that they're trying to keep. They're trying to keep the little graven image in their pocket, to which they also, other times, will object. And that's the funny thing about us humans. We do this all the time. For example, we fight really hard and with great passion to make sure that that phrase, "In God we trust," is on our coins. We make sure that our national motto is in schools and things like that. We want that to be a part of our identity as a country, and for those who believe in God, our identity as believers in God. And yet, at the same time, that we are saying, I want that on every coin. It must say, "In God we trust," because that's who we serve. We then go out and spend this money on things that have nothing to do with honoring our God whatsoever. Now, I'm not talking about church collections and things like that, so don't be getting all clickety off into something else about that. We live for ourselves with our money, don't we? And this is part of their hypocrisy too. We live for ourselves with our money and then want to argue, well, they better not take that "In God we trust" off of there. Okay, but do you? This is Jesus' ultimate question to these people. Do you recognize the hypocrisy? Because he does. In verse 15 it says, knowing their hypocrisy. It wasn't a question. He knows their hypocrisy. If there is hypocrisy in me, if there's hypocrisy in you, well, Jesus knows that too. And he knows it every time we're speaking up passionately for some principle that we don't actually live day to day in reality. Okay? He knows the difference between the person with the "In God we trust" bumper sticker and whether or not they're actually trusting him, or whether or not they live their life for themselves by their own strength and to their own glory, leaving him in the dust. He knows the difference, right? And so should we. And so with these men, he hands it back to them. So whose coin is that? Whose likeness is that? And they answer, it's Caesar's. He says, well, then give it back. Isn't that funny? He says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. Well, let's deal with the first easy part of this statement. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Okay, he says, well, that coin, that's his. What do I even want with that? What do you even want with that? If you're so upset about its idolatry, why are you fighting so hard to keep it? And so he says, give it back to him. And it's genius in the way he does this, because in the way he says it, oh, whatever is his, let him have it. He disarms that part of the argument, but I think even more deeply, he says, what's that really worth anyway? That's just a pretentious coin that belongs to a puffed up man. It's as if Jesus just says, flips it back to him. Who cares? Why are you trying so hard to keep something? Who cares? But don't we spend most of our lives, far too often, okay, not in everything, but far too often, don't we spend most of our lives trying to hold on to the things that don't last? That's why Jesus said, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy and thieves do not break in and steal. Why? Because far too often Jesus knows we try to lay up for ourselves treasures that are destroyed by moths and rust and that can be stolen and can be taken away from us, even be taxed away from us, right? Why fight so hard for things that don't last? Why live so long for what doesn't matter? He says, if that's Caesar's, give it back to him. Who cares? That's not the way you and I look at taxes, right? But that's what he says. He says, you're really kind of focused on the wrong thing. So if they're going to fix their hypocrisy, and if it's in us too, if we're going to fix ours, how do we do it? It's the next half of that statement. Give to God what is God's. And he's not talking about the collection plate, folks. Give to God what is God's. Well, what is God's? It's us. It's not just money. It is us. Everything that we are, the whole way we live, and the purpose for which we live is God's. He created us for His kingdom. He created us for His work. He created us, yes, to enjoy life and to be blessed. God likes to bless us, but to bless us with purpose. And what is that purpose? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. This is what they weren't doing. They were fighting over the money. They were fighting over what they perceived to be the truth about this Messiah that they thought was false, but actually was not. He is the Son of God. And in all that fighting, they'd stopped loving God, even though they thought they were fighting for God. But you can't love God and fight against what He's trying to show you for your life. Push back against and constantly say, in God we trust. Yeah, but not now, God. Right now, I want to do this my way. In God we trust. Yeah, but not now, God. I've got this thing I want. In God we trust. But yeah, I know you said that I'm not supposed to cheat on my wife and embezzle, but If I'm going to claim in God I trust, then my life has to look like it. And that comes with obedience. And what's the obedience? Oh, obedience, that sounds horrible. Not when obedience is love. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's the commands that they knew well and could recite from memory, but were not living. Well, what about me? What about you? Is there something that you have been holding on to that's really that's dust? It's Caesar's kingdom. Who cares? Whose picture is on that? Who even needs it anyway? That you've been fighting for your whole life while losing your grip on the things that really matter. Love for the Lord, love for your neighbor, compassion, generosity toward those in need, justice for those who are truly oppressed. Why do we fight so hard for what doesn't matter when we could live for what matters for eternity? And they were amazed, and I am too, because Jesus has basically just said, what are you going to live for? What are you going to live for? One of the choices matters. The other crumbles. Choose wisely. God bless you. Live a great week.